Afternoon and welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ronan Smith. I'm an Associate Director of Employment here at Social Ventures Australia. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. It's good to see a really interesting mix of organisations that have sort of registered to participate. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Please feel free to let us know what country you're joining from in the chat. Before we get into today's presentation, I thought it would be useful to spend a couple of minutes to explain why we have undertaken this work. So today's presentation will talk about some research that was carried out into frontline supervision skills for supervisors of young people. That work was funded by the Tasmanian Community Fund. And the research actually grew out of the Employer Innovation Lab work that we carry out at Social Ventures Australia. So through the labs, we work directly with employers to identify practical ways to improve employment outcomes for young people facing barriers to work, and supporting those employers to create opportunities for young people that wouldn't get access to them otherwise, specifically young people who don't have a degree. And through that work, one issue kept surfacing. We were getting feedback from multiple employers that they really wanted to recruit and retain more young people. And they were recognising the value and the opportunity that young workers would bring. But they were also telling us that supporting young people in the workplace could be challenging. And many of them were questioning whether their frontline supervisors had been given the skills, the tools, and the support to do that well. It wasn't isolated. We heard it repeatedly from different employers across different industries in different parts of Australia. So it prompted us to ask the question, what does the evidence actually tell us about supervising young workers effectively? So we assumed there'd be lots of evidence and a strong evidence base to answer that question. But in reality, we commissioned some research, some desktop research into what the evidence told us, and we found a bit of a gap. There's quite a bit of research about youth unemployment and youth employment and education and training. There's a lot of research around leadership and management. There's research around supporting apprentices. But we found relatively little youth-focused evidence examining how workplace supervision influences whether young people stay in work and thrive. So we wanted to change that by producing some research that was practical, evidence-based, and directly useful to employers. So we'd like to thank the Tasmanian Community Fund for funding this research. Their support made it possible for SVA to partner with the Tasmanian Behavioural Lab at the University of Tasmania and start to build an evidence base that to date it doesn't really exist. So today's webinar, it marks the end of that research phase, but it's not the end of the project. Thanks to some funding that we've received from AUDA, we're moving into the next stage of the work. And Dr. Terri Simpkin is joining us today from the other side of the world. So thank you, Terri, for joining at an ungodly hour. But she's leading the co-design of practical online learning modules for frontline supervisors, which are translating today's findings into resources that employers can use. We're also at SVA applying these findings directly into the work that we do through our Employer Innovation Labs. So when we engage with employers, we now have evidence to talk around the key practical behaviours that you would want to see in employers and how you need our supervisors and how to approach training them. In September, we're going to be running a lab in Ipswich in Queensland, working alongside local employers to improve outcomes for young people in that region. And you'll forgive me if I use this webinar as an opportunity just to say that we're currently recruiting employers to participate. So if you're based in Southeast Queensland or Brisbane and you know organisations that might be interested, we'd be really happy to speak with you after today's webinar. But now I'll hand over to Professor Swee-Hoon Chuah, who led the research through the Tasmanian Behavioural Lab. Swee-Hoon will present the key findings and the key priorities that emerged from the research. And then following that, Terri will discuss how we're taking those findings forward through the development of practical supervisor training resources. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so if you want to use the Q&A tab to add any questions as the presentations happen, once both Swee-Hoon and Terri have finished, we'll go to the Q&A and answer any questions that you have. But with that, I will hand over to Swee-Hoon.
Great, thank you, Ronan, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. Although this project was conducted in Tasmania and the report is about young Tasmanians, I'll frame the findings broader because many of the issues that it raises will be familiar elsewhere. You know, where young people are entering an unfamiliar workplace and there's a team of supervisors, team leaders, buddies who are helping them learn what that work requires, right? So that's kind of like the context. So today I'll do three things. One, I'll explain who this report is about, and equally important, who it is not about, because that's important for you to sort of frame the findings. Second, I'll summarize the main findings. And third, I'll discuss the implications of the findings for practical supervisor support resources. The central message is very, very simple. You know, supervision is a workplace capability, and we will come back to what that means later. Nationally, the youth unemployment remains substantially higher. So youth unemployment remains substantially higher than overall unemployment. So this is ABS data in June 2026. ABS figures showed that the national youth employment rate was 10.7%, and this is compared to the overall unemployment rate of around 4.4%. So it's more than double. Tasmania has its own youth employment challenges, and this report is based on Tasmanian interviews, but I'm starting nationally just to show you that this issue is not only local. Young people's transition into work remains a significant issue across Australia. Now, much of the public discussion around youth employment focuses on whether young people can get a job in the first place. That's where most of the work is done. That matters, but getting the job is only one part of the transition. The next question is what happens once young people enter the workplace. And this is where SVA's own work is important. It has pointed to frontline supervision as a key part of the youth employment picture. So it's Employer Innovations Lab that Ronan mentioned. Many employers rated their own manager training as only average or poor, more than 60% of that. And then in earlier SVA work, many employers identified that their team leaders and supervisors need more skills to support young people. So basically, the issue is not only whether young people are work ready, it is also whether workplaces are ready to support young people once they arrive. And that is where this project, this particular report comes in. It focuses on frontline supervisors as a key part of that transition. So what happens after a young person gets the job and how the workplace supports them to settle in, to learn, and to stay engaged. So that's the context for this report. Just wanted to say that the purpose of the report, it was deliberately practical, right? We're not trying to produce a general theory of youth employment, and we're not trying to audit Tasmanian employers. The aim was to generate insights that could help employers, supervisors, and workplace development, workforce development partners to help them better support young people in the early stages of employment. And the specific lens that we employ in this project is day-to-day supervision. And what I mean by that is the ordinary, repeated interactions through which these young workers learn how a workplace actually works. So, for instance, just to give you a list of things that we looked at, how were expectations explained to them? How were the tasks demonstrated? How is feedback given? How are mistakes handled? Do they know where to go to ask for help? And do the supervisors themselves have the time, the confidence, the system, and the backing to support young workers well? So you can see that, we've deliberately narrowed the focus. We're not looking at formal HR policy. We're not looking at training curriculum. We're not looking at recruitment practices. We're looking at the everyday supervisory practices, right, that help people build confidence, build capability, and build connection at work. This is the most important slide in the deck. That's just me. I'm just saying that this slide is important because it explains who this report is about. And this is important when you are reading the findings. I don't want to overclaim, right? So the people in this project, the young workers in this project, they are not young people in general. They are young people who have already entered paid employment. They've already entered paid entry-level work. So to be included, right, they needed to be, again, in paid entry-level employment, and this includes apprenticeship and traineeships. They needed to have started their employment when they were aged between 16 to 19, and they also needed to have legally exited school or have had an appropriate exemption. So this is how we sort of defined young workers in our study, right? And by the time we interviewed these young workers, they were between 18 to 22. And the report also included interviews with frontline supervisors. So in addition to the young workers, we interviewed frontline supervisors so that we had both sides. We saw the both sides of the relationship. That scope matters for how we read these findings. The report gives us insight into early work experiences after job entry. It does not tell us about all young people trying to access work or all young people currently disengaged from work. Right? And it also means that these findings should be read alongside rather than instead of other SVA and Tasmanian work on barriers to employment. There is also an important caution. This is a small qualitative study. It was not designed to measure how, good or poor supervision is, across Tasmania or elsewhere. Participants were recruited through employer networks, so the sample may include workplaces that are already more engaged in supporting young workers. I mean, in fact, many participants described positive current work experiences. So I would not use this report to give percentages of good or poor supervision, right? So the value of this report is very different. It helps us identify practical risks and enablers, right? It helps us identify what makes early work easier to navigate, or what supports learning, and what and where the problems can emerge, when expectations, feedback, support, work culture were not clear enough. So the findings are best read as practical lessons for improving supervision and not as a measure of how common the problem is. All right, so basically, a bunch of caveats, I know, but it's important that we do not overgeneralize this work and that we are using it for the purposes for which it was generated. So the central finding of the report is this: supervision is a workplace capability, not only an individual supervisor's skill. What we mean by this is that good supervision should not only depend on whether one individual supervisor happens to be patient, experienced, organized, or good at teaching. Individual supervisors clearly matter. Please don't get me wrong. It clearly, I mean, the interviews show that young workers, their experiences was strongly shaped by those people who supervised them. So individual supervisors clearly matter, but this report shows that supervisors can only do their work well and can only do their work consistently well if the workplace makes it possible for them. This means that supervision needs to be supported by the conditions around it. Clear expectations, practical systems, visible support pathways, enough time, and backing from the managers of those supervisors, right? So instead of focusing only on whether an individual supervisor is good with young people, we also need to ask, has the workplace made it easy and possible for the supervisors to support young workers well? And next comes the findings. This is the bulk, this is the meat of the work that we've done. So what does well mean, right? What does this look like from the young worker side? What do they need from their supervisors? So from the interviews we conducted, 5 things stood out. You can see the 5 things there, but let me explain them to you. And this is the first bit. It obviously feels very, it's obvious to us, we think, right? But this is the first time we've actually heard it said, right? The young workers very, very clearly said that there were many hidden parts of work when they entered unfamiliar workplace, hidden parts of work that they would like to be made visible early on. Right. So as somebody who's already in a workplace, you wouldn't know what they are because they are almost like practice rules and regulations that you're used to, and you know it, but you don't know what you know what you know. It's like a curse of knowledge, right? The young people don't know it. So the first, they wanted the hidden parts of work to be made visible. And they are not only, so when they come in, they're not only learning, right, the technical aspects of work, right? They're also learning how the workplace operates. So that's separate, right? They come in, they learn the skills, the technical aspect, but the other bit is that they're learning, how we do things around here, right? The invisible rules, right? The routines, the communication norms, the expectations, who to ask for help, what good work looks like in that particular context. Some of this is obvious, like I said, to people who are experienced, but it's not obvious to a young person who is entering work for the first time. One young worker we interviewed described trying to work out things, right, as basic as where to sit at lunch. Those things sound small, but they affect whether the workplace feels like something that this young person can navigate, whether they feel like they belong. That's the first point. The second point was that young workers valued practical task teaching. They wanted someone to show them the task, to let them try, to check their understanding, to give them feedback, right? So basically, not somebody who's hovering over them all the time, but teaching them and then giving them the space to try, and then checking their work, and then giving them feedback. So in simple terms, show, try, check, feedback, rather than breathing down their necks all the time. The third point was that they wanted a safe space to ask questions when they were unsure and make mistakes, in a safe space so that they can learn. They were more likely to keep learning when they could ask questions and when they could admit that they did not know something without facing harsh criticisms and without embarrassment. And it's important to point out that this does not mean lowering standards, right? This means helping them raise their uncertainty early before small mistakes become even bigger problems. The fourth point was that support often came from more than one person. It's not always only the formal supervisor or the formal team leader that gives them support. They rely on their buddies in the workplace, senior workers, team members, other tradespeople, and sometimes they mention even people from outside their immediate workplace. So they need a variety of support that comes from different angles and different aspects. And the final point, the fifth point, and I think this is really important, as important as the first point, right? Staying in work, what made them stay, what the retention and the engagement is more than just, simply having that job. They talked about whether that work felt worthwhile. They wanted work which feels worthwhile, which feels manageable, respectful, developmental, and sustainable. Yeah. So they talked about pay and work hours. They did. But they also talked a lot about relationships, learning, the variety of tasks that they were exposed to, respect, and most importantly, whether they could see a future pathway. It's actually very interesting, and I think we sometimes forget, right? Small everyday signs of respect, such as being thanked and spoken to courteously, right? That actually really helped them, and they actually pointed that out to us very, very strongly. It's sad that that they have had to point that out. Just small courtesies, being thanked was something that they were grateful for. So early work is not just about learning tasks, right? That's important, but that's not the only thing. It's learning how to belong, learning how to ask, learning how to improve, and how to see a future in the workplace that they are at. So that's from the young workers side. Those are the things that helped them. Those are the things that made them engaged and want to stay. And we, of course, also looked, because we are building resources for frontline supervisors, we also looked at the supervisor side, and it's basically the other side of the same relationship, right? So if young workers needed the workplace to feel more visible, they can navigate it, they are safe to learn in that workplace, then from the supervisors, their description is what it took to create those conditions for the young workers. So it was actually really interesting when we asked the supervisors what they actually did, right? They were the supervisors, but they were not just allocating tasks, right? They were onboarding, they were teaching, they were giving feedback, they were noticing stress, they were supporting well-being, they were managing interpersonal issues, they were dealing with workload pressures, they were thinking about how to retain the young people, all at the same time. And so they were juggling many roles at once. And I think this is something that we need to appreciate. And many of them told us, right, that they built these capabilities, all those things that they do, right? These capabilities, many of them built them informally. They learned them through experience, trial and error, peer support, watching others. Some lucky ones had some from bigger companies, they had structured systems around them, right? But many described having to work all these things out as they went along. So they were learning as they were doing. Supervisors also pointed out something very important, that technical competence, right, was not the same as supervisory readiness. Just because they were good at a job, just because they had technical skills, does not automatically prepare them, right, or to prepare someone to teach, to give feedback, to notice uncertainty, and to respond to well-being concerns. So I'm an economist, right? I know economics, but that does not automatically prepare me to teach students, right? So I guess that's how I understood it. So the technical competence is not the same as everyday readiness, all right, to teach the job, to give feedback, to communicate to the young workers, and they should we should not assume, right, that just because somebody is technically competent, they're able to transfer that to the young workers. What helped them? So we said to the supervisors, what helped you do your job? What helped you be an effective supervisor to young workers? Time. They mentioned, many of them, having the time and the space to do it. They mention systems, the systems that surround them, peer support, managerial backing. So it's important that the people they report to give them the support and the backing to do all those roles that we just mentioned just now for the young workers. And also clear escalation pathways. They needed to know where to go next, to sort of put something up that chain. So this is where the central finding, I think, of this report, which I've already said a few times, becomes concrete, right? Supervisors can only support young workers consistently, and they can only do it well if their workplace also supports them. That's the most important thing. And the key takeaway here, I think earlier there was some reports that said, look, we think that our supervisors need more skills. It's not simply that they need more skills. They need workplaces that make good supervision possible. Right. So yes, they need skills. They may need skills, but the workplace has to support them. That's why it is a workplace capability. The report then, and I think that Ronan and Sophia will share the report as well after this, and you can read it. I wrote it, you read it. But the report translates these findings into 7 practical priorities. The important point is that these priorities, they are not a compliance checklist. We don't want to panic people and say, oh, this is not a compliance checklist, right? The priorities are just a practical bridge between what our interviewees, the young people, and the supervisors. It's a bridge between what they told us, right, and the kind of resources that we can develop based on what they told us. You can see the table. I won't read every row of the table, but I do want to talk about how the priorities in the table fit together. So the first group of priorities, 1, 2, 3, and 4, the first 4, it's about everyday supervision. It's about the things that happen close to the young worker, especially in their first few weeks at the new workplace, right? So this is the things that we talked about before, making the expectations explicit early, treating supervision as everyday teaching, making questions and mistakes safe so that they can learn, and making support visible and easy to access, right? So those are in practical terms, those first 4 priorities is about reducing uncertainty for young workers and making early work clearer for them, right? Making that work clearer. To help them understand how the workplace operates, how good work looks like, what it looks like, how tasks should be done, and so on. The second group, so 5, 6, it's about conditions that, this is from the supervisor side, it's about conditions that make good supervision possible and easier. So as I said before, the supervisors, they need time, they need tools, resources, peer support, escalation pathways, and managerial backing. The final one, which you can see like in a italic, that's kind of the 7th, and that sits like a broader or systems level, right? We need entry-level roles, right, that are more developmental. So when young people come into the workplace, right, at entry-level roles, those roles need to be designed, right, so that they offer real learning, they offer task variety, and they offer feedback, they offer manageable workloads, and they offer future pathways, right? So if you think about those priorities, right, so they basically tell you that improving supervision requires work at 3 levels, right? The first one is in everyday interactions, so that's on the ground at the coalface if you want. The second one is more managerial, supporting the supervisors. And the third is more system priority, right? Improving the quality of those entry-level opportunities overall. So at 3 levels. So the final report, when you read it, there's a section, and I put it in the appendix because it was a big section. It was in appendix 2. And in that section, it gives some examples of possible supervisor support tools. And these examples include like first week conversation guides, a buddy checklist, a stage task guide, feedback prompts, a support map, escalation pathway guides, turnover review templates. Now, these are not meant to be a fixed toolkit. They're just a starting point, right? Starting point for developing, for piloting, and for adapting, right? So the exact list of tools, I may have listed them when you're reading them in the appendix, but the list is less important than the function that the tools are meant to serve, right? They need to help workplaces make expectations visible. They need to help workplaces support gradual learning, make mistakes and question safer, clarify where to go for help, back supervisors in practical ways. So when you are looking at the toolkits and at the examples, right, it's not about those exact tools themselves, right? Think about the functions that they need to serve and adapt that to your own workplace. That is more important. And based on our findings, the design principle is also very clear, right? The resources that we develop to help supervisors, they need to be brief, role-specific, and easy to use within the normal work routines. Because the supervisors, they're already operating under real-time and operational pressure, right? And so we don't want to add any more burden, right? If the resources we develop for them, right, adds more admin burden, right, or pulls them away from the work that is on the coal face, right, or even assumes, right, if the resources assume that the work that company has a dedicated HR capacity, right, not many companies have that luxury, right? Many of the companies that we deal with in Tasmania, they are SMEs and they don't have a dedicated HR capacity. And so the resources, design principles of these resources need to take this into account, right? So they should not add administrative burden. They should not, make it more difficult for supervisors, as in like take away their precious time, and so that they can read crazy frameworks, like big thousands of pages of frameworks. We don't want that, right? That's not something that they're going to use consistently into the future, right? So the test is not whether the tool looks good on paper. The test is whether it fits the realities of everyday supervision and the people who will use them. So this is now where the project moves, right, from diagnosis, which is what I've done, to design. So in the report, we provided the evidence base and the design principles. And as Ronan mentioned to you, Dr. Terri Simpkin is now leading the next stage of the work to use this evidence to develop the practical tools based on those design principles. And she will talk to you after this about what she's doing, the important work that she's doing. So for me, and the team who worked on this project, the practical challenge is this, yeah. When a young worker struggles, right, we should not only look at the young worker, but at the conditions around them. Yes, individual factors will matter, right? The young workers, they do need to have the skills, they do need to have confidence, they do need communication skills, they do need to exercise that judgment. All those are important, but the report essentially asks workplaces that employ young workers to look at the other side of the equation as well, right? Were the expectations made clear? Was the task demonstrated? Was their understanding checked? Yeah, was feedback given constructively, right? Did they know where to go for help? And did the supervisor have the time, tools, and backing to support them? Right. So the same point applies to supervisors, right? If we expect supervisors to do all the things that we expect them to do, onboard, teach, feedback, monitor, support, then the workplace has to make that possible. right? So that's where the practical message is. So it's very simple: support the young workers, but also support the conditions around them, and that is what we mean, right, by our central finding that supervision is a workplace capability. I will close there. The main message I want to leave you with, right, is that early work success is not only about preparing young people for workplaces, it's also about preparing workplaces to support them when they come in. So thank you to SVA for commissioning to the work, to the young workers and supervisors who took part in our research, and to members of my team, especially Amber, who is here today, for being part of the project. So I look forward to the discussion after Terri. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Swee-Hoon. And yeah, we're really proud of the report. It was reassuring reading it and seeing that a lot of what it was saying was not shocking or surprising, but within that there were still areas that were very specific and unique to young workers. The importance of mentors and buddies, as well as supervisors, the importance to young people of their frontline supervisors in terms of their experience of the workplace, and then the whole area around making the invisible elements of work visible, which all, when you hear it and read it, make perfect sense. But it's about making those things explicit. So we're really happy that the high quality report that was produced by Swee-Hoon and Amber and her team, is contributing to evidence in regards to that. But as we say, that's the first stage of the work, and we're moving on to phase 2, which is funded by AUDA, and I'll hand over to Dr. Terri Simpkin, who is leading up on that, just to give us a brief overview of that.
Many thanks, and thanks to Swee-Hoon, Amber, and the team for putting together something that is really very important in terms of the messaging that this isn't about training supervisors in an isolated sense. It has to be something that is actually much more broad than that. And so in the last couple of weeks, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, maybe 3 weeks ago now, we held a couple of co-creation workshops in Tasmania, so in the north and the south of the state. We had a good representation of individuals at that at those activities, from industry, from government, from social enterprise, the broader third sector. And they came together really to allow us to unpack those practical priorities that the report identified. So rather than supervisory suites of skills being around that technical space, and I think that one of the key issues that came out of the research made it explicit that being a good technical operator does not necessarily make you a good supervisor. And so it is a distinct set of capabilities that we're looking to develop here. And so rather than it being just an extension of the technical work or a coordination of work, those supervisors really are needing to develop up some capabilities around coaching, around workplace learning, around how to be a good role model and perpetuate the type of culture that an organisation would like to see supporting young people in the workplace. And so we really did take that idea that this is not an isolated training program. And in fact, it was very clear from both of the sessions that we ran that individuals said, we do not need another training program. And so we talk about this as a suite of curriculum, but really at the end of the day, what we're looking at here is a collection of tools that people can draw on as and when they need, with a support base that explains why those tools should be in place. So, for example, as we mentioned, having proper onboarding, having proper checklists, having proper processes for making that implicit work that we know goes on because we've been in the workplace for some time, making that implicit activity, or the implicit activities, or the implicit behaviours, or the implicit expectations much more clear. And that's not necessarily about skill development. That is something that underpins culture and is much more broad than that. And so really out of those sessions also we identified, as the report did, that there is a triumvirate of perspectives that we need to take into consideration here. There's obviously the supervisors. We need to take into consideration how young people are actually going to fit in with that or lead on that. And of course there's organisational systems, processes and behaviours, and that's obviously where that leadership support comes in too. And out of that suite of activities that we ran in the events, we came back to those practical priorities. So those 7 practical priorities were unpacked. We dismantled those 7 priorities and we rebuilt them again in terms of how those practical priorities were actually going to be made explicit in a suite of curriculum or suite of tools, or even down to the behaviours that we would expect to see of supervisors in the workplace working with young people. And so out of that came another suite of design principles. Again, following on from the work, is that it had to have obviously a focus on young people. It's not a generic suite of tools, but also that idea that Tasmanian organisations exist in a context that has a whole raft of other implications and priorities, particularly given the fact that the majority of our organisations are micro to small to medium enterprises. And that goes back to the point that we may not necessarily be seeing organisations that have the systems and structures in place to present their supervisory or develop their supervisory capabilities in a way that you might see in larger organisations. We have a range of demographic issues. We have context in terms of change. We also need to recognise that young people are coming into a workplace at a time when there's huge disruption, particularly in certain industries. We also need to understand that careers and the way that people develop their careers is not the same as it might have been when our supervisors or our leaders or ourselves actually came through our early career. So part and parcel of what we're looking at here is the capability development, but it is also about how people identify the experience of young people and how it is different to perhaps their own. So what we really need to see here is not so much here's a bunch of skills and capabilities that you need to learn. It's here are a suite of perspectives that you need to become au fait with, because the young person standing in front of you is not necessarily will be coming from the same conceptual or social space that you are. So expecting people to supervisors to develop up this capacity for sense making and empathy for the young person's lived experience in the workplace, that doesn't happen by some mysterious process of osmosis, and it certainly doesn't come from being good at the technical aspects of work. So out of those 2 co-creation workshops, we have developed a suite of principles which I'm sharing with our design partners. So it's Kahoot, who are building the actual tools on the platform, and we are looking at a broad suite of underpinning evidence that is already existent or extant in the literature, such as early career transitions, psychological safety, how people, particularly in early career, develop up their identity and sense of belonging. We're also very keen to build into this the capacity to develop an understanding of the importance of reflective practice as a key part of developing culture and identifying how different people come to the workplace differently. And so rather than it being an online training program, that is not what this is going to look like. It will look like a suite of of materials that will provide support, will provide insight, will provide why should we be doing this? So, giving people a real key understanding of the underpinnings of why certain capabilities should be developed. And again, coming from that perspective that we're developing up an ecosystem rather than just focusing on developing up or minimizing the idea that we're coming from a deficiency model. Our supervisors can't do this, ergo we should just teach them to do this, then then that problem will be fixed. That is not the approach that we're taking here. It is a much more broad, much more holistic view of how we're actually bringing that capability together. And as the Swee-Hoon and Amber's work identifies, that this is an organisational capability development program, not just a suite of materials or curriculum that is going to be aimed squarely and only at supervisors and developing their elements of skills. So it's a really interesting piece of work, and I'm reiterate Swee-Hoon's point about A, this is important work, B, it is something that is going to be drawing in from a whole raft of different elements. So obviously there's the underpinning literature that is out there, so we've got a good strong evidence base, but also looking at what else is already in the public domain, so that we're not actually reinventing the wheel. We're certainly not in the space of actually just replicating something that sits elsewhere. What we're really trying to do is something that is specific to the Tasmanian context, but can also perhaps be useful in other jurisdictions as well. In terms of where to next, I'm in the process of doing that underpinning evidence review at the moment, and then we'll start to pull in other materials that we've seen from perhaps other organisations, material that is already out there, and identifying how it might sit alongside some of the training packages, with a view to coming back to that point that Swee-Hoon suggested. We don't want to be adding another layer of administration. And certainly if supervisors are already doing training in the workplace that might be aligned to national training programs, if we're actually developing up capabilities that can be recognised as a current competency, well, then that kills two birds with one stone. So people may well find a benefit in saying, well, look, here is a portfolio of evidence from this work that I've done to develop up these capabilities that might go on to be recognised against formal training. So that's not necessarily the guiding principle or the a key driver, but it's certainly one of those nice to have that we could put onto the top, and really it makes no extra effort for us to build that in at the very beginning. So that's where we're at now. I'm in consultation, as I said, with our colleagues at Kahoot to see how we could actually pull this together. Certainly the materials themselves have to be easily accessible. They need to be customizable. They need to be broadly applicable, and they need to be flexible enough so that they can fit those micro organisations right the way through to SMEs, and even the organisations that already do have perhaps HR support as well. But I'm mindful of the time, Ronan, and I'd like to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask questions, so I might hand back to you.
Thank you, Terri. We have had a couple of questions come through. So the first one is from Libby, who's asking, were there any learnings specific to communicating with young workers and their preferences, Swee-Hoon?
Yes, Libby, I was just jotting down some notes because I saw your question. I think there was some useful learnings, but I would be quite cautious. I think the report we didn't see a particular channel that the young, a single sort of communication preference in terms of a channel that the young people prefer. It's more that they needed communication to be made clear and made explicit. From the supervisor side, though, this was very interesting. Supervisors describe the young workers as needing some support to move from more informal, when you come in from school and there's a very informal school-based communication. So it's like when they text, they write to you rather than to you, you know. So it's that sort of informal communications, guiding them to sort of move from that to workplace and customer-facing communication, do that more effectively. And also, you know, they like to text, but then obviously supervisors say, look, you know, there are certain times when texting is more appropriate, sometimes calling is more appropriate, sometimes, you know, face-to-face is more appropriate. So they just needed that sort of guidance. But so those are some of the learnings, but we didn't see anything. Amber may correct me if I'm wrong. Amber, feel free to jump in if I'm wrong. But I don't think that there was a particular form or channel that the young people prefer. They wanted it to be clearer, more explicit, but not by a particular channel.
Thank you. And the second question is from Ricky, which sorry, Amber.
Oh, no, all good. I was just thinking of adding well, when it comes to just a generic communication, lots of supervisors would say like, young people definitely prefer to just text people unless, for example, if they are receptionists, they're more used to actually talk to clients. But in many entry level, when they're work-related tasks, young people do kind of prefer just text. It's very hard for them to pick up their phone. That was an observation.
Yeah,
that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. And the second question is from Ricky in relation to phase 2, which is, will the information be mobile friendly and digitally inclusive?
Absolutely. And this is a conversation that we've already had with Kahoot, that some elements that or some recommendations or some ideas that actually fell out of the co-creation workshop are probably outside of the scope of this particular element of the project, but certainly it provides us with a platform to understand where we might go with building out a suite of resources. But it has to be digital first. There's no point in providing tools that are only going to be, you know, paper-based or only accessible to a certain cohort of supervisors or organisations. So yes, I mean, we've already had those discussions with Kahoot on how they could actually pull those materials and, you know, support structures together as well.
The modules that are developed on the back of this work will be freely available online, which we're really excited about as well. Well, that's all of the questions that we've had. So we've just had one through. Yes,
we have one from Peter.
Yeah, we will be sharing a recording of the meeting, and we'll be sending that through to anyone who's registered for that as well, which is awesome. So thanks, Swee-Hoon and Terri, for sharing your expertise and your insights today. It was really, really excellent. And thank you to everyone who's joined and contributed through your questions. Hopefully the sessions highlighted just how important this frontline supervisor work is and how important frontline supervisors themselves are in helping young people not just enter work, but succeed and stay there. And again, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Tasmanian Community Fund, who made funding for the research possible. And we're also very grateful for AUDA for supporting phase 2 of the work, where, you know, where we'll be translating those findings into practical training. And if today's webinar sparked any ideas for your own organisation, or if you're interested in becoming involved in the Employer Innovation Lab that we're establishing in Ipswich, or if you know any organisations that would be, we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you about that. But thank you again for your time, and we hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much.
Very important work, really important.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.